Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the IIS. My name is Anastasia Voronkova. I'm a research fellow for armed conflict here at the Institute and editor for Armed Conflict Survey. I run the Armed Conflict program that aims to analyze developments in 40 active armed conflicts and selected trends and issues comparatively in armed conflicts globally. I'm delighted to welcome you today to this event on Africa's youth population, challenges and opportunities. There is an increasing number of youth in Africa, and they are frequently seen as creators of instability, are particularly closely associated with conflicts sometimes, in that they are seen as easy targets that are frequently easily lured into armed groups, criminal groups, smuggling networks, and so on. Today I'm delighted to welcome to speak about some of these issues and perhaps to challenge some of these assumptions on Africa's youth, Dr. Marc Sommers, who is a senior conflict advisor with the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations in the U.S. Department of State, and also a conflict youth, gender, education, and development expert. He has a long-standing evaluation experience in 21 war-affected countries, 15 in Africa, and prior to working for the State Department, he provided technical advice to policy institutes, NGOs, and donor and UN agencies. He is also the author of the Outcast Majority, War Development and Youth in Africa, and he will draw on some of the ideas from that book today. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Anastasia. Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming. I'm going to be drawing from work engagement on youth issues at the State Department, particularly with regards to my bureau, which is the Conflict and Stabilizations Operation, or CSO, and there's information with a flyer at the door there. Youth. So I'm going to just give you, before I start, 3 framing ideas. The general response to huge youth populations. So when we talk about huge youth populations, this is unprecedented in recorded human history. That this is the youngest population of humans that we've ever seen. It's hard to get when we're in Europe or America, it's hard, or Japan, it's hard to get our mind around this, how incredibly youthful the human population is today, because in many parts of the world, some parts of the world, the population is getting older. In Sub-Saharan Africa, where I'm going to be focusing this discussion, it's the youngest population in the world, and basically from India to South Africa, we have what's known as youth bulge populations, and basically every country in between, pretty much. There's also East Timor is extremely young. In Europe, Kosovo is unusually young, and there are young populations also across Latin America. The general approach, according to research, in response to these huge populations by states, is repression. And so what happens is, according to the research, that states respond proactively with state violence, state repression, detentions, and so forth. And so that's sort of the dynamic that is the starting point in terms of state relations with young people. The priorities often are made in development. This is based on research that I've done prior to coming to the State Department. But the priorities of international agencies, development agencies, are generally set, and also governments are generally set before talking to the target group. So there would be analysis, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa on focus on the formal sector investment and also in the agricultural sector. Okay, where are most youth in Sub-Saharan Africa? They're either in cities or heading there, and they're in the informal sector. So they're in the exact opposite location that the priorities have identified. So this is a way of talking about, of just touching base on not only in this situation unusually significant and unprecedented in our experience, but also that the approach also can be, I think, quite often counterproductive. So let's begin. I'm going to start with two questions. The first one is the following. Why are male youth seen as threats to their own societies? How is it that male youth are seen as such threatening people? And they are. I think there's no question about that. And the response is also seen as they're a problem, particularly when they're in cities. This is seen as a threat. Often there's this assumption that unemployed youth, if we don't give them a job, they're going to set the place on fire. Obviously, that's not true. How do we know that? Because there are unemployed youth all over the place, and they're not violent. Which is the second question I wanted to ask, which is, why are most youth peaceful? And this is this kind of wonderful mystery that we have facing us, is that even with, as I mentioned, state repression, even with unemployment, most youth resist engagement in violence. Even in terms of war, if you look at Sierra Leone, for example, during the Civil War, a tiny fraction of youth in that country got directly involved in the war. And most of them had to be abducted. So it doesn't follow that because you have unemployed youth, most of them are going to be involved. Tiny fractions get involved in violent extremism. Tiny fractions get involved in gangs. There's been actually a lot of research on this in Central America. Even in what they call the sort of gang-centered areas, 5%, maximum 10%, get in any way involved in the gangs that governments are so concerned about in Central America, in Latin America, and elsewhere. So we have this wonderful opportunity, it seems to me, to rethink how we look at young people, because we see them as threatening, particularly male youth. This is a very gendered issue with regards to security. It's about male youth. There's something bad, there's something wrong, there's something volatile, there's something explosive about them. And then in terms of the research, it doesn't follow. For example, most wars in Africa are over. All of them are youth bulge countries. Okay? So there's this focus in quantitative research on, or there has been, between this correlation between youth bulge populations and violence. How about a correlation between youth bulge populations and peace? Because if the wars that have ended are in youth bulge countries in Africa, because they're all youth bulge countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what I want to do for in this presentation is do two things. First, to give a couple of examples of what the State Department is doing on youth issues. One more broadly, and then with reference to this Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization operations where I work. And the second is to look at war development and youth in Africa, to look at the issue of exclusion and its impact, the development approach, and why there's kind of a mismatch between youth priorities and development priorities on a regular basis. And then a framework for reforming development, which draws from my book, The Outcast Majority. So the presentation will end with three linking themes that draw from both parts of the presentation to try to, if I can, try to knit things together. Let me start with the State Department and youth issues. One thing that I found in talking to people at the State Department who work on youth is this feeling that governments often see male youth through a lens of fear, which really aligns with my research outside of the State Department before I came, as creators of instability. Together with other actors, the State Department has been trying to change this narrative. And I think the best example, and this is really quite an exciting development in my view, is the U.S. government was a co-sponsor of the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth security and peace building. Now, what this resolution did, and it came out a couple of years ago, what this resolution has done is propose a new way of looking at young people, and to raise the prominence not just of them as being engaged in violence, but actually being on the forefront of peace building. And so it proposes to change the perspective of how we look at young people. And as I said earlier, there's no question that most of them are resisting engagement in violence. It's quite obvious. This resolution, what it proposes to do is to try to bring governments and young people together to look at, to work on peace building in a more coordinated way. So with regards to my bureau, CSO, one of the things we've been doing is work on something known as CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. What my bureau does is provide analysis and assessments, and also provide sort of tools for planning and monitoring and evaluation to other people working on CVE in the U.S. government, which goes beyond the State Department. There's a lot of activity on countering violent extremism. So to do this analysis and preparation and sort of thinking about this very big issue, how do you counter violent extremism in the world, is start with the local context. Now, as you'll see later, starting with the local context totally aligns with the research I've found in doing with youth before I came to the State Department. It's important to start with the local context, for example, to understand the local environment. We have a very interesting, useful example from recent days here in this country, from a great tragedy that took place with the incidents around the Parliament building with what's his name, the young fellow who drove the car and ran people over. That's right, Kali Masood. What's that?
He was 52.
He was 52. Good point. What I was going to point out is that there was a newspaper with regards to understanding the local context. There is this concept of clustering that takes place, and apparently there are 5 places in Birmingham, or in the Birmingham area, where a lot of extremists come from. So to think in a broad way about violent extremism in youth or 52-year-olds is one thing, but generally speaking, the motivations are very locally based. And when you can look at particular neighborhoods, communities, where large numbers of people are becoming violent extremists, and then understanding that local context can be a starting point for figuring out what to do. So the sort of the framework for analysis at CSO breaks down into two issues. One is drivers that support violent extremism, and then resiliencies that work against violent extremism. And if I'm going to give an example of each, to give just to illustrate this. So a key driver is something that I mentioned previously: elevated levels of state abuse and violence. State abuse normally is thought of as corruption. Young people are actually very deeply moral in their way of seeing the world. This is just a developmental phase. Hopefully they stay in it, but not necessarily. That there is elevated levels of state abuse and violence are highly associated with the emergence of new violent extremist groups. As I said earlier, there's also research that when you have large youth populations, youth bulge populations, the general tendency of governments is to respond with violence and repression. So it's one of the results of this is that it can fuel the growth of violent extremist groups. So in terms of resilience, a key source of resilience is positive social networks. Research is very clear that youth are influenced by their peers. If they're with positive sort of peer influences, they'll go in a positive way. If they're with negative peer influences, it can go in a negative way. So an aspect of focusing on resiliencies is to reinforce nonviolent norms and resilience to violent extremism. And there are lots of sort of locally based, contextualized ways of doing that. So these are some examples. I don't have a lot of time. We can wait for questions if you'd like to get more into these issues. But I'm going to shift now to a broader look at war development and youth in Africa. You'll see that a lot of the issues dovetail pretty closely with what I've just been discussing. So in my own research, the central irony that sort of drives what the analysis is the following. Youth are demographically dominant, and yet most of them see themselves as members of an outcast minority. This is where the title of the book, my recent book, The Outcast Majority, comes from. So the biggest challenge is not youth demographics, which tends to be the focus, but it's youth alienation. It's alienation, the separation of most young people in a society from quote-unquote mainstream, which is really the driving idea. And if you think about it, if these are really young populations and most of them feel that they don't belong, then actually the mainstream is very small. If you look at civil society and their elite people, their elite youth or elite adults, a good question I think it's worth asking is, do they really represent outcast majority youth? In my experience, rare is the case that they do. The separation, the class separation between elite youth and non-elite youth is profound in most societies. They actually have different priorities, they see the world differently. Talking when, this common idea, we need a youth voice. Well, when you have millions and millions and millions and millions of youth in a country, what are you talking about? It's almost, when you, to go down into a youth voice isn't really necessarily very helpful unless you know what you're looking for. And to think that any youth represents all youth is ridiculous, frankly. So the bigger idea here is we are all operating in a sea of youth exclusion. We have these, as I've said, these unprecedented populations of young people. And then there's two forms of exclusion that came out from my own research. One is called systemic exclusion. In Sub-Saharan Africa, generally speaking, it's the chances of you going to secondary school are very close to zero in most countries. There are exceptions. DRC, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria have higher ratios, expectations than most other countries in Africa. But generally speaking, a young person can expect to not go to secondary school or not finish. Another aspect of exclusion is something I'm calling cultural exclusion, and that has to do with the chances of how you become an adult, recognized as an adult in society, an adult man, an adult woman. The idea of being a youth is actually, culturally, in most societies, has nothing to do with age. It has to do with this period of transition between childhood and adulthood. The problem is, across Africa and across the Middle East, leaving youthhood to gain recognition as an adult man or woman for most youth is almost impossible. It's never going to happen. So that's our big challenge, it seems to me. For example, for farming cultures in Africa, normally you need, for a youth to become a man, you first need some land. You have to build a house. Often you have to pay a bride price. You have to get married in a church or in a mosque, or in a sort of a recognized ceremony. So you have to get married. You have to have children. You have to support your children. All of that is a requirement of manhood. What about womanhood? In traditional societies, in farming societies, generally speaking, you have to get married, real marriage, a marriage that's recognized, not a live-in situation, a formal marriage, not an informal marriage. And then out of wedlock, inside of that marriage, you have to have children. What's going on? For most female youth, womanhood is dependent, traditionally, on manhood. If there's no one to marry, you can't become a woman. Case closed. What's happening? Lots and lots and lots and lots of women, of female youth, are becoming mothers. In some countries, I think it's the majority. I just came from Burundi. I think it's almost certainly the majority. So, in Kirundi, in Burundi, there is no word for a unmarried mother, because it's not supposed to exist. And yet, maybe more than half of all female youth are unmarried mothers. So how can you help this huge population if they're not supposed to exist? How can you help the children of these unmarried mothers if they're not supposed to exist? This is a massive problem, and I think one of the things that happens in this, there's this obsession with male youth in the youth dynamic, and the interactions. Gender is not about male or female, it's about the interaction. And what's been lost in this is the fate of female youth, and also the fate of male youth, this idea of never becoming a man. So, limited schooling and failed adulthood can help fuel a lot of things. I'm not going to go into detail because there isn't time, but I'm giving you some examples. I mentioned class inequality, emasculation, which is pretty obvious if you can't be recognized as a man, unmarried motherhood, which is one that I mentioned for female youth, and then other things about this frustration and this sense of failure and this absence of a trajectory of success for a lot of young people in prescribed ways. It's not that success isn't going to happen, but not in the ways that have been laid out in the past. So some results are domestic violence, drug and alcohol abuse, and when I say that, I do not just mean male youth. Not at all. The research will not support that one. It's for male and female youth. Prostitution, if you're a female youth and you become an unmarried mother and you have children, you're an embarrassment to your family in many parts of Africa. Where do you go? You go to a city. What's a common job? Arguably the most common, prostitution. So urban migration is a very important issue. The rate of urbanization across Africa is the highest in the world. The future of youth is largely going to be in cities in Africa, and I think we can presume across the Middle East as well. Urbanization is here to stay. The focus on the agricultural sector, I think, has to do with a bit of social engineering regarding youth if they're not there, if their aspirations are aimed into cities. Cities are really the future in Africa for young people, and they have very good reasons for going there. They're not the ones we expect, but that's something we can talk about in the discussion if you like. So what happens when war comes into the picture? Because this is a framework I'm talking about generally. Let's talk about armed conflict. Well, what happens is that war-affected youth often hide who they are, what they did, the challenges, the psychological and physical challenges they face. They don't want you to know about them because it will often make the situation even worse. That these are dangerous people, these are bad people. And they also hide the talents they figured out during war. And a second irony that comes out of this research, and it has to do with what can we learn from warlords, people like Charles Taylor, okay? What can we learn from them? It turns out that there's one thing that's really important that we can learn, it seems to me. They exploit young people. There's no question about that one. But when they abduct young people, we're talking about those that have child-based operations. They recognize talents in these young people that no one else seems to see. The best spy you can have, I've learned from researching with ex-combatants and ex-former child soldiers and so forth, is a young female adolescent girl. Nobody expects her being a spy. And so what happens is, or a young commander, a 15-year-old commander in Liberia, an 18-year-old, colonel, having major decisions. Now, this is not going to happen in peacetime, especially if the young person doesn't have education. In war, they're recognized, their talents are recognized. And I think one of the tragedies is that these are seen as not very educated people, not very useful people, not people with much potential if they don't have education, if they don't have that proper background. So who recognizes that these people can do almost anything? Warlords. That's something that's come out of my own research. So what's the development response? I'm going to mention one challenge out of many, many, many. But this one I think is with reference to youth programming. One of the things that I found in doing research, again, this is before the State Department for the Outcast majority book, is in talking to donor officials, and this would be public bilateral donors, multilateral donors, private sector donors, didn't matter. The enormous pressure on success. Think about that. Masses and masses of poor people, poor youth, some of them on drugs, drunk, prostitutes, selling drugs. I don't know what they're doing, all sorts of things. Former child soldiers. You're going to have success? These people have no interest in making you look good, right? They got other priorities involved. So here's an example from a donor agency official. This was on a website. By the way, this is not the U.S., but they use dollars. It's one agency. This is on the website. Our donor agency says that it delivers results and demonstrates value for every dollar invested in international development. Every dollar? Imagine if you're trying to implement a program and everything's supposed to work. What do? Well, in interviewing implementing agencies and donor agency officials, a trend came out, which was really quite surprising. It is what you do without mentioning it. This was what people reported is you put elite youth in your program. So here's a quote from an implementing agency official. Programs focus on elite youth because they're easier to get. You have to show results every quarter. So you need youth who are connected and easy to find. Just want to point out that quite often donors expect success in the first quarter of implementation. The first quarter. No learning curves are allowed here. You're supposed to know before you go in. Okay, here's a donor official. It's not that people aren't aware of this. Here's a quote from a donor official. So many youth program participants are children of privilege. Those who benefit are establishment youth who want to keep the status quo. So what's an unintended result of this trend. When you target elite youth for programs, unintentionally, you're promoting inequality, aren't you? And you're demonstrating favoritism for the fortunate few. One thing I learned in doing research in Sierra Leone is if you've got the sons of chiefs and politicians in your population, and you have all these youth who are desperate to get into that program, in terms of the impact of your program on youth not in the program, the worst result of it is if they get a job after that. This just crushes people. If you're an unmarried mother, plaiting hair in a market with 2 kids, and you're living alone, you want that youth program. You got no shot at getting in them, most of them, because what happens is elite youth get in, and if those people get a job, it's really difficult for you. My impression is that it fuels kind of rage, but more than that, sort of fatalism, like nobody cares for me kind of thing. So another issue is that it says to people in a population that if elites are in the program, then we're on the side of the government. We're on the side, donors and implementing agencies unintentionally are on the side of governments. Now, since most youth are very clear that the status quo doesn't work for them, that's not the place you want to be, because status quo governments, what they want is things to change because it's not working for them. So to align yourself so closely with elites is a tough starting place for implementing change. So what do we do? I'm actually quite optimistic in part because so many people that I interviewed are aware of the fact that the current situation isn't working, and in my view, it will never work unless there's significant change. So I'm going to mention I'm drawing from a framework from the Outcast Majority, the book that some of this is drawing from. 3 steps. And this is something that aligns with what my State Department work on countering violent extremism found as well. Qualitative research, largely qualitative research with excluded youth majorities, right? Learn something about the target group. The second one is targeted policy advocacy, and the third is strategic programming. So let me give you a sense of what I mean. Step 1 is assessing excluded youth lives. So some questions is, what are their priorities? Having done a lot of work on education during and after wars, it's common to talk about the values of youth and not the priorities. There's a big difference. If you're a poor young person, your values are very important. But what must you do? What's driving you forward, on a day-to-day basis for survival or moving forward? It may be different. Like, for example, you might want to go to school, but you can't. Why? Because there isn't a program. Why? Because I'm an orphan. If I go to school, what am I going to eat at the end of the day? And I'm telling you, the orphan populations in some of these countries is mind-bogglingly high. South Sudan, Rwanda, Burundi, Sierra Leone. Malawi. These are enormous populations, and they can't possibly go to school if there's no way for them to work and get something to eat. It's pretty obvious, but so what factors exclude youth? This is something that research needs to, in order to help excluded youth, we need to know about something about the context of exclusion. And then, which programs and policy reforms have the best chance of advancing youth inclusion? Which I think you'll find with most governments, they want this too. Because youth inclusion promotes stability, security, all the things that governments want, all over the world. So, there's a way to engage on this, but it starts with accurate information. So the second point is to advocate for policies that reverse youth exclusion. So quality assessment work should identify policies that exclude large numbers of youth. Informal economies. Most youth have no chance except, they have to work in informal economies. Formal sectors are very small and often riven with corruption. Rare is the case that you'll find a female youth in the formal sector, except maybe as a secretary. And usually insiders get into the formal sector. Why? To be in the formal sector, there's often some money that you have to pay. The people who run these businesses don't want strangers in their companies. They want people who will, keep it quiet. The things that they need to do, the payments they need to make in order to move their company forward. It's not a growth area for most youth. Would be nice if it was. So informal economies, housing, land access. How can you become a man in most of Africa if you got no access to land? Well, we're going to find out, because land access for most youth is impossible for various reasons. Post-primary education. Okay. And then I think if you do research and you don't find problems with the police, if you do research on excluded youth and you don't find that police issues are coming up, I'd be very surprised. So the last point is to establish programs to address excluded youth priorities. If you can only reach a small proportion of youth, now programs are going to reach maybe 1/1000th of 1% of all youth. So strategic targeting, you'd think, would be a high priority. Not necessarily, but I'm urging that should be a priority. How will you demonstrate in the sea of exclusion some degree of inclusion? How are you going to do that? How will your program address the priorities of your target group? And then how can you minimize negative impact of the program on ones who can't get in? So 3 linking themes. I'm closing here. The first, and this is actually comes from work that, conducted by the State Department and then research that I've done before I came to the State Department, which is start with local context. And keep in mind that we're operating in most of the world in a sea of youth exclusion. Quality research should be the starting point for action, not the priorities of headquarters, sectors, government priorities. Youth do not live in sectors, quite obviously. The second one is, a linking theme is counterproductive governance. And what drives this, it seems to me, is a fear of male youth. Governments tend to respond to huge youth populations with repression and violence. And this is counterproductive, but it's almost like a knee-jerk response to having lots of young people in your country. And then policy reform. It's important to realize that implemented policies, there's a lot of policies that aren't implemented. I'm talking about ones that are implemented. Implemented policies usually impact exponentially more youth than programs. It's actually, in terms of impact, it has a much greater chance of affecting youth lives. So I'll thank you very much and wait for your questions.
Thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes or so for questions and discussion. If you could state your name and affiliation before asking your question, that would be much appreciated. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah. So if I state my affiliation, my question hopefully will make quite a lot of sense. I'm a lecturer in war studies at King's College, but I'm currently with the Commonwealth Secretariat writing a CVE strategy for them. So that's partly my interest, and so I've got a lot out of your presentation. Focusing on CVE in particular.
Yep.
Obviously with the Commonwealth, it's a predominantly developing world club of countries, and there's a lot of Sub-Saharan African countries there. We're thinking about the sort of ways in which we can frame CVE in terms of the broad thrust of what what the Commonwealth can do. Youth networks is one of the things that the Commonwealth has got quite a lot of traction already. I was really interested in your question about separating elite youth from, I guess, the rest of youth in terms of CVE interventions in particular. Could you maybe talk a bit more in detail about what makes CVE different than general kind of post-conflict programs targeting youth? Is there something particular on CVE that you would be able to talk in more detail about?
Well, I mean, I think the elemental difference, it's a good question, thank you. The elemental difference is probably the most significant one, which is that CVE is really trying to understand why do tiny, tiny fractions of young people get involved in violent extremism. So it's elementally different than youth and development, which is looking at, you know, what do we do about these colossal, unprecedented numbers of young people in a population? So the starting point, I guess, is the same on youth, but it's going in different directions. Now, I think the crossover has to do with the issue of resiliencies that CVE, at least as the way it's the sort of the analytical framework in my bureau has put together, is what are these, you know, resiliencies that can be supported, that can promote the movement of youth towards peace building as opposed to getting sucked into violent extremism. So in that aspect, there's a major kind of overlap, trying to encourage youth towards issues that, movement towards this peace building direction, which is actually very prevalent and which actually we don't often draw on. So that's the overlap.
And just very quickly with the targeting, does that mean then there's more emphasis on targeting which sub-demographic within you?
Well, here's where we have to, I think, back off and think about with regards to violent extremism and the sort of the broader youth and development sort of segment. I'm just going to pull from my own research in cities, in 3 African cities, with regards to gangs, just to give an example, because this is not on violent extremism, but sort of violent groups. So right away, when you look at these issues, pretty quickly you start seeing differences by local context. Okay, so in South Sudan research before this crisis in 2011, what was who in Juba? It's probably the fastest growing city in the world, by the way, whenever there's statistics. In Juba, who's joining a gang? Well, the leaders tend to be people that have connections to the government, you know, an uncle who's a minister or something like that, almost across the board from the research that I found. Who are the foot soldiers of these gangs? Orphans. They got nothing else to do. There's nothing else for them, for a lot of them, in talking to some of the ones. And often they get forced into it. What about in Nairobi? Nairobi has a situation, Kenya has a situation where there's a lot of expectation that more people are getting secondary education. More people are getting university education than in a lot of countries in that region. So when that happens, expectations go up. And when expectations go up and then there's no job. So the dynamic is, according to research, that higher educated kids get involved in the gangs there. They're infuriated that how could I get a university degree, for example, and then there's nothing for me. And so the whole profile is very different. Just to give you an example. So really knowing local context on these issues is absolutely crucial. And that comes out of both sets of research, CVE and then youth populations more broadly.
Any other questions? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I learned a lot. It's not particularly an area I know about. I'm Memdu Karakulukcu. I lead the Global Relations Forum in Istanbul, Turkey. Actually, as I said, I don't know the area much, so I'll ask a few clarifying questions. The first one is about these numbers. When you say a tiny percentage, I wonder what that is, because the only number you gave us is the 5 to 10% in America, Central America. For me, that sounds very high. So I'm assuming and hoping that it is lower in other places. So what is tiny is like, just to understand what that means. And of course, it is not only percentages, I'm assuming, that matter in this issue. There should be probably some threshold above which a certain population can start triggering ripples of mobilization among the youth. I mean, as I said, I'm just probing the question.
Triggering ripples of what?
I mean, there could be sort of silent, non-violent youth that can be triggered once violence starts sort of progressing in a society. I don't know if that concept exists, but at least, that's sort of a hypothesis I would be thinking about if I were running a government somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
That you look at it in peacetime, yes, they're fine, but you don't know what would happen once things get out of hand. Then you also, within this, you mentioned the cluster issue. So I think as much as the overall percentages, it would matter a lot if this low percentage is clustered in areas where suddenly the percentage in a small society goes to 20, 25, 30% of youth in a small part of town. So the distribution. So that's one sort of set of issues that I would kindly ask if you could clarify for us. The second one is this elite youth problem, which I think is, of course, very pertinent when you think about anything we do in our societies. Inevitably, you start with those whom you can communicate with. Is the elite youth versus the broader society a sort of is there a cutoff there, or is this a spectrum? So you go from very elite, less elite, less elite, so that once you start influencing the central elite of youth, do you get actually positive effects in ripples? Is there that continuum that we can leverage in some way, or is it just a non-starter?
Thank you. Is it okay if we take 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Time. Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Carsten Boger. I work for the Africa Center at the London School of Economics.
Oh.
And my question would be kind of more in relation to the developmental aspect of it. Who would you see as like the most important stakeholders in a kind of more comprehensive approach towards kind of including youth in development of these nations? Like, are there any experience that nation states are really kind of useful partners in this? Have they realized the potential threat there to their societies? And if so, kind of what have been the kind of, are there any successful examples?
One more question.
Okay.
Yes. Go ahead.
I have a gazillion, but I'm going to start. One is a follow-on from yours there. And my name is Olivia Bosch. I was a UK expert to a Security Council resolution, and and aware of the donors that you mentioned, what impact they have. We did have in the policy of the committee, though, that in implementing security solutions, that they tried to integrate that into the economic development of the country, so that the country didn't receive that they had the burden. Okay, so with that.
Sorry, I didn't follow that.
That when you're trying to, let's say, improve security solutions, and I can give you details and things of that, that you try to integrate that into the countries, and usually it's developing countries, existing priorities, which are not dealing with certain, let's say WMD. They're not interested. There's a lot of money on security of WMD that can, for example, help with customs modernization, as which countries need customs modernization, or countries are doing health modernization. But without those, you can't implement higher order.
Okay.
Just to say, I don't want to be blunt, but I have to leave in about five minutes. So if
I'll take your question. I'll answer your question first.
Take it as an offense, please, because I just have.
Sure. Understood.
So, tied a little bit here, if you have a gang that has a link to government and they have orphans, is there a way that through government policy and because of the connection that gang leader has with government to somehow turn them into a labor force to build infrastructure which many developing countries need, and therefore it can tie in with maybe larger economic development goals of the State Department, for example, etc. Just a thought to do that. And the other is, you mentioned UNSCR 2250.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize, I can't remember. There was also one about women in security and peace building.
Right.
Is that
1350.
1325.
1325.
Right. Is there a way to get the two communities working, those who implement those, to work with that? Because the mothers have children, and so you have the youth and the mother connection. And I believe our chair lady, there was a talk earlier this year on Boko Haram and Somali membership of Al-Qaeda in Boko Haram and Somalia, making comparisons, and where the women and the mothers had some kind of job or relationship with the sons, then they would stay out of the piracy. I'm simplifying that result, but I was just wondering if there's a relationship in the both donor communities and the recipient communities of UNSCR 2250 and 1320.
Okay, great questions. I'll do my best. I would implore all of you to exhale for a moment going forward, because a lot of these issues, a lot of your questions are informed by assumptions that are not found in research. Okay, most male youth never get involved in violence. Full stop. They resist engagement in violence. Most female youth never get involved in violence. It's a fact. Okay, so the starting point doesn't matter what they're elite or non-elite. The starting point is that they're mostly peaceful, and that has to be understood. And when you see the level of degradation and humiliation that these kids are put through in so many situations, it's a miracle, right? People will come by and say, come on, join this or that. They will not do it, and they got nothing. And they get bopped on the head by the police, and there's sexual violence. You know, if the police are robbing you, who do you go to? There is no one to go to. Okay? So even then, they will not get involved in violence. These are facts, and I have an enormous amount of admiration for these young people. I don't know how they do it, actually, in regular cases. So I just want to make that sort of broad statement. The starting point that you're having has to do with, as I said, this fear of male youth. It seems to me it's a dominant fear, and it colors our assumptions. Most of the people who are writing about youth and violence they wouldn't know an excluded youth if they ran into one. Why is that? Because quantitative research is what it's based on, not in talking, most of the research, not in talking to the target group. So, sorry, I'm done. I'll get off my soapbox now. The stakeholder issue, I believe you asked. I'll go to that because you have to leave. I'll jump into that one. States are very useful partners. This idea of what I wrote is realizing the potential threat to youth. The whole idea is for them to realize that most of the youth are waiting to be partners with governments because they're not violent. So I think it's important for governments to realize that repressing them is counterproductive. I mean, what does a government want? Peace, security, staying in power? Okay, well, why not engage with your super young population in a more positive way? I think on-the-ground research can be very helpful to governments. If you do the research and it's very negative and you go out and you broadcast it, then you're probably not going to get a positive response for the government or any government. You're embarrassing them. But if you deal with your findings in a different way, then governments, in my experience, there will be some people in the government who will be engaged. Particularly if you start the research by saying this is what we're going to do, and what are you concerned about, and you put that into your research. So it's an important stakeholder, and I think there are ways to engage because everyone's afraid of their own citizens. It's really incredible. And I have yet to find a country that has a real plan for all their super young people. What are you going to do? Most countries don't even know how to start to answer that question. These national youth policies are not implemented. So what are you going to do? I don't know. What are you going to do? It's a hard question to answer. No one's been put in this situation before. And to think that we're going to turn everybody in a city into farmers, it just doesn't happen that way. There's very little evidence that once you go into a city, you never leave. So rare is the case that you leave. I mean, half of all Liberia is in Monrovia, at least half. So that question, I'll go. I'm just jumping around here because I know we don't have much time. So the improving the security solutions, the gang issue, larger economic development goals. The one thing I noticed on yours is that an analysis had already presupposed what the answers are. And what I said earlier is very few youth think that status quo is going to work for them. So the customs issues you're talking about and so forth, there's nothing wrong with those, improving the health sector. But to presume that these are the priorities of young people who are excluded, it doesn't fly.
That was a background issue to
Okay.
one approach taken. Okay, but the question was tied to his, in that the gangs to somehow turn them into a productive labor force, for example, for infrastructure. It's a separate question from what I was saying.
Okay, so one of the things that in the research,
things, yeah.
here, I can give you one of these if you like. Thank you.
Sounds like a win-win for everybody there.
Well, in a way, it's still presuming that you know what these people want, and you don't even know who they are. So it's.
But you have to do that research, okay?
Right,
And
without
each
presupposing what
countries
those.
have an issue with infrastructure. I'm sorry, I've spoken to many countries.
There's no question that infrastructure is helpful. To think that you can put unemployed youth into an infrastructure program and that they're going to come out with the kind of result that you want without knowing who they are or what their priorities are is a second question. So I think shoehorning youth into existing priorities is probably the wrong way around.
You have to encourage, educate.
You actually don't know, okay? I mean, I'm not you in particular, but it's important to find out. I'll give you the example. Research in Rwanda. This is before I went with youth in Rwanda. This is before I joined the State Department. The biggest issue there is housing. It's not unemployment. Because without a house, a boy can't become a man. And so they're dropping out of school to build houses that they probably will never finish. And so focusing on infrastructure jobs, for example,
Houses like habitat.
all I'm saying is that the biggest issue there, if you want to reach youth, is the housing crisis. And so the reason why that's not being addressed is because people aren't finding out from young people what their priorities are. It's not to say that these ideas are, what you're saying, are not positive ideas, but it's important to start, it seems to me, with the priorities of excluded youth and then build from there. So the 2250 and 1325, 2250 is the new Youth Security and Peace Building Resolution. It actually is using 1325 as a model on how to go forward by doing a major research piece. I'm an advisory member of that committee to do research to figure out what the strategy should be going forward. So they actually are linked. And there is concern about gender issues in 2250. So the last two questions before we finish, I'm doing my best here. The cluster issue triggering
numbers. I mean, what is when you say a tiny?
You see, so you're thinking that if there's a little bit of violence, it's going to explode into larger violence. The research doesn't hold up. You can have gang-infested areas in Guatemala, Honduras, Cali, Colombia, going to the gang ones. It stays at 5%. and these are the places that are considered gang infested and so on. Well, it's a problem, God knows. Does it explode after 5% up to 20, 25? The answer is no. So there probably are exceptions, but I don't know of them. I'm just talking about research on this issue. So that, again, I think your question comes from this idea of reading this quantitative research that these are really bad, dangerous, violent young men. Research doesn't hold that, back it up. The one research with youth on the ground, it's just not there. So I think I really think we can't be driven by our fears of the unknown, which are male youth and female youth. I mean, in most definitions of youth, female youth don't even exist. It's practically speaking, in terms of the research I've done, when you say youth, you mean male youth. As one donor said to me in research for the book, if male youth aren't in a program, it's not a youth program. So it's a gender program. So, and the other issue is this issue of, you were asking about elite youth?
I mean, is this like a digital divide between elite youth and non-elite youth, or is it a continuum, a spectrum where you start triggering the elite because it's the easier part to have an impact on the elite youth, it's in terms of access, and then hope that it will have ripple effects across the society through linkages? It doesn't happen, is the message I got.
Okay, so an elite youth is a locally is a contextual definition. Okay. In Burundi, an elite is anybody who has 1 year of secondary school. In Nigeria, it's going to be different.
Oh.
And probably in different parts of Nigeria. It's going to be different in northern Nigeria, where fewer youth go to school, as opposed to the southwest, where a lot more youth go to school, proportionally. So you're going to have to get that local distinction, because it varies. Generally speaking, youth without education are the ones who are in the excluded youth majority. But if you have, I mean, it can be very tough. If you have a university degree and your parents have like sold land, sold a cow so you could go to school, secondary school, for example, and you don't have a job after that, oh my goodness, you're worse off. You know, now their family doesn't have a cow. You're worse off than the ones who never tried to go to secondary school. In Rwanda, what they said is that's the reason why they don't even want to try going to secondary school, because they've seen those who go in and then can't finish, and they're worse off. So, like, okay, I'm not going to secondary school. No way. I tell you about this guy and this guy and this guy who went, or a girl, and then they can't finish. That's kind of the expectations are higher, the humiliation is higher when you can't finish. So be careful what you wish for with education. It's not that it's not important, because it's extremely, monstrously important to societies and to young people, but failure and raised expectations are big problems. So I think we need to, the final point is just to step back and realize, take a sense of, are you really afraid of these young men? Is that what's driving your thinking about this? Because if it is, I think I encourage you to reflect on that, because as I said, in my research, there's just nothing there. There are small groups that are, yes, violent, but most unemployed male youth never get involved in violence. So anyway.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time, so we'll have to wrap up. Please join me in thanking Dr. Sommers for a fascinating and very, very interesting and informative presentation.